Cannabis is retaking America. It used to be the most relied on tincture in every home until it was demonized in the early 1900s, but now it's back. Even more states will legalize cannabis this November. There's enough momentum now between business activists and patient activists that the door on cannabis will simply not close again. Patients everywhere are getting relief from using different forms of the cannabis plant, and entrepreneurs smell opportunity. And many, including myself, are excited to build an industry from scratch. You are listening to the first episode of the Shaping Fire podcast. I am your host, Shango Los. Shaping Fire will focus on innovations in the cannabis sphere, including both business disruptions as well as new research into cannabis and health. I offer you access to cannabis industry luminaries talking frankly about cannabis in ways you will not find elsewhere. If you have followed me from ganjapreneur.com, I appreciate that. If you have not heard the 54 episodes of the podcast I founded for ganjapreneur.com, you should definitely check those out. There is an exceptional amount of smart analysis in those interviews from the top minds in cannabis. But, I wanted to go out on my own, so here we are. Please subscribe to Shaping Fire. Tell your friends about the show. Set a trend. Today, my guest is Dr. Dominic Corva. Dominic Corva is the founder and social science research director of the Center for the Study of Cannabis and Social Policy, known more commonly as CASP. He was most recently visiting assistant professor in public policy at Sarah Lawrence College, and he continues to be an affiliate researcher at the Humboldt Institute for Interdisciplinary Marijuana Research at Humboldt State University in Arcata, California. His work has been published in the International Journal of Drug Policy, Political Geography, the Annals of the Association of American Geographers, and ACME, a journal of radical geography. His dissertation research examined the political economy of international drug policy in the Western Hemisphere, and his postdoctoral research has focused on the political economy of cannabis agriculture in southern Humboldt County. Today, he's here to talk with me about cannabis policy transfer. So welcome to the show, Dominic. I'm glad you could join us.
Thank you, Shango. Glad to be here.
So, Dominic, when Colorado and Washington first began to write rules for cannabis sales, they had never done this before. Some of the approaches worked well, while many of them very much did not. So now we're at the point that Alaska and Oregon are in rulemaking, and there looks to be maybe 6 more states in play to begin licensing cannabis sales after the November vote. Do the new states appear to be learning from the best and worst practices of Washington and Colorado?
A little bit, but not in any particularly formal or organized way. I think that the news cycle is probably driving a lot of attention to things such as pesticide regulation, which is a big oversight, I think, early on in our process. And that's one good example. So the other states get to start where we are right now instead of taking 4 years to come around to, the fact that this is of some concern for public health and safety.
I think that's a really good point that you make, that the media role that they play in policy transfer between the states. To what degree do the other states' regulators find out what's going on in a target state by just reading the news versus talking to the regulators in states that, directly by getting on the phone and calling them?
I actually don't think it's all that organized. I've been paying pretty close attention. And as you know, I kind of brought up this possibility of bad policy transfer between Washington and Oregon maybe a year ago, when Oregon seemed to be, moving towards a more of a strict approach. But, in the subsequent year, Oregon's also kind of backed off and fixed some things. Mm-hmm. So I think that it really depends on how organized and where the industry is in terms of their conversations with their lobbyists and their legislators. I think it depends on conversations between industries in different states. There's plenty of people who are developing brands in different states. They have experience with, policy in one state. And I actually probably think that it's through, lobbyists that a lot of policy transfer possibilities open up.
That makes a lot of sense. So what you're suggesting is that the lobbyists are actually doing the homework for the regulators and going to other states and figuring out what the best way to go is, and then bringing that to the legislators.
Yeah, I believe that's the case for the most part. Certainly, there's some cross-border interaction. I'm not that familiar with the personal lives of politicians in different states, but for the most part, these people, when they're outside the state, they're probably discussing national issues, and there's a lot of those besides cannabis. I think that's also in the case of Washington, most of our legislature just was so sick of it anyway. They don't really care to chat too much. There's not a lot of sort of formally organized caucuses, for example, that are regional caucuses where, members of different political parties but around the same issue get together and try to coordinate. I think that will come, and certainly the case of California, since it's like about 25 other states, all in one, you're going to see a lot more of that on a sort of intra-state level. That still has to happen, actually. It has to happen not just between states, but between jurisdictions. So many jurisdictions, they haven't even learned the lessons from other jurisdictions in their own state yet.
Yeah, well, I'm seeing that all the time, and it's really frustrating too to realize how when they say you don't want to see the sausage being made, and it's really astonishing. At each state you've got them making regulatory attempts at the state level, which then get kind of remixed at the county level, and you've got people passing moratoriums or changing zoning laws, and so that's happening at each state, and then the states are talking to each other either via lobbyists or the media or political visits, and some of that gets transferred and some of it's not, and then the different groups, concerned parents or investors, these different groups have different amounts of power at these different states. It's really a pretty chaotic mess, and it's kind of frustrating to see something that we all care about as much as cannabis to be handled this way, but it's also a primer in how a government actually works.
That's true, especially, government by initiative, I would say. The citizens' initiatives have been how cannabis policy has been changed, which means we've been sort of leading them by the nose, to come along and do this. Now, I would say that it probably will get a little more organized around revenue policies. I think that that's something that politicians are particularly interested in, and that's how they view cannabis as a new cow to milk. And I think that it's far more likely that we will see a little more harmonization, let's say, of tax rates, as that information will be sought out by local and state policymakers.
For those of us who don't have a lot of experience talking about policy or thinking about policy, I'd love to flesh out a little bit. You said, this is what you get when you legislate by initiative. And I'm assuming, you're comparing legislating by initiative versus, law passing by the state Congress. Can you kind of describe the difference and why you kind of gave that nod to the challenges of initiatives?
Sure. Initiatives push the legislatures to do something that they clearly weren't going to do. That's their whole point. Legislators, because if they were going to do it, they would simply, rewrite laws or write new laws. So this is a democratic mechanism essentially for going around, let's say, the inertia, I guess, of policy agendas in a more sort of conservative and fixed and static environment. In any state, in any jurisdiction, you have a set of concerns which reflect the people who are already politically and economically included in the state. So an initiative usually takes people who are not already politically and economically included and gets their message to policymakers and forces their hand. And certainly you can see in the Washington State initiative process, not only did they have to force their hand, but they told the legislature they had to lay off the initiative for 2 years. They couldn't touch it because it's understood with an initiative that you're pushing them to do something they don't want to do. And so you got to give it a little room to breathe before they just kill it.
That I can see how I didn't know that they put in the policy that they couldn't touch it for 2 years. And, that I can imagine how that actually makes everything that much more challenging, because not only are the people pressuring the legislators to do something that they were not necessarily ready to do, or at the very least didn't have the inertia for, but now suddenly the legislators have to get educated on best practices and how they want to go about it, maybe not begrudgingly, generally, but at least on topics that they were not already educated on. I mean, we saw that both in Colorado and Washington as far as how they're interacting with patients, and then recently, last legislative session in Washington with the passing of 5052, which was erroneously called the Patient Protection Act, which actually kind of gutted most of the patients' rights. And we found that so many of the legislators were being educated by the commercial cannabis lobbyists. I think that may be less likely in states where it's not passed by initiative, where the Congress folks have got the ability to do their homework in advance first.
Well, I kind of agree with you there. I think that one of the things that we're learning through the cannabis situation is how, in fact, our legislators are educated. And the fact is they're educated usually by industry and particular special interests. So once the initiative was passed, there was a period of interest formation, right, in the cannabis industry that kind of gathered in the ones who were a little more organized and had a little more access. In other words, they tapped into, folks who were a little more politically and economically included already and just used those channels. Then the legislators got educated to the extent they wanted to be educated on, and way more than they wanted to. I mean, they still don't want to be educated, Shango. What they want to know is, what's the fiscal note? How much is this going to cost, and how much is it going to bring in? And that's about the extent of what they want to know about it. And so this is kind of the danger of it going forward, that this will be the primary education that they will receive and the primary mode in which they will operate and change laws. I think it's interesting, the possibility that there will be more, instead of initiative, but legislative cannabis reforms. We can see that this has happened with medical marijuana in particular already. Obviously, we're probably a long ways off from a recreational law that's passed by a legislature. Unless California happens to, not pass the AMA Act, which it looks like they will, but it's up in the air. And so it's really, who are the stakeholders really that are kind of forcing the legislators to make a decision, really, and that's really what it comes down to. Is they're going to make a decision. Most legislators who are not the primary sponsors of the bill or otherwise part of some sort of political calculus are being told by their party how to vote, basically. So they're still not educated, Shango. And there's a lot more work to be done to actually educate them on anything more than really the fiscal note.
So let's look at this from the perspective of states that have not passed recreational or adult use laws yet, because so far we've talked about Alaska and Oregon and Washington and Colorado, and we're all in the process of sorting this out and figuring out how to make this work for everybody. But there are other states that are early enough in the process that they can take actions to educate their policymakers so that maybe they get it right the first time, or at least closer to right, and B, they can involve the rule makers in a way where they see the bigger picture. Because in all of the states that have passed laws already, it seems that the gaps are not that the people or the legislators are bad. It's just that they're underinformed. What would you recommend for folks in states that have not passed laws yet on how they can get ahead of this and educate their regulators so that they can, get something passed from the beginning that tends to work better?
Oh, man. Well, I'd say that they really have to understand that they would have to pull off feats of organization that we have never seen from the cannabis community. And I want to be very serious about that. Our cannabis community consists of a lot of people who, as I noted earlier, are not already politically and economically included in the system. Their interests, their militant interests in cannabis in particular, do not translate well in conversation with legislators. And honestly, there's a reason for that. And it's not just because it's about cannabis. It's because they're not part of the system. could be, tangentially related to the fact that they consume cannabis or have radically different beliefs about punishment in society. But these are minority beliefs, and the only way for a minority to become powerful is to get extremely organized. And I got to say, again, the cannabis community has never pulled it off, really. Even in California at the statewide level, that initiative that Dennis Peron was running was not going to succeed until Ethan Nadelman came in with DPA money and, actually, changed the language a little bit and also got the money out there for the signatures. So for a law to work, our entire culture has to change, Shango. It's got to change from the bottom up. There has to be more tolerance of, I think, dissident beliefs. Dissident beliefs that are founded on evidence in particular. They can be presented logically and isn't as in the interests of the people who otherwise don't really care.
There's a lot of depressing ideas in that, honestly. But it kind of reminds me of that statement. They say, "Oh, you go to war with the army you have," And it's like, well, we may want our cannabis scene to get more organized and raise more money and be deeper in our experience, but this is all happening now. And so, even though it's going to be messy and chaotic, hopefully, the more states that legalize, the better we're all going to get at it, and we can get smoother with implementation as we go. So let's go ahead and take our first short break. You are listening to Shaping Fire, and we're talking with Dominic Corva. As a business owner, you are incredibly busy. In reality, you are responsible for everything your company does. You have so many responsibilities every single day that often you just don't have the time to really dig into something as deeply as you'd like. You know there is more that you could do to reach out to new customers and to encourage loyalty in the customers you already have, but you certainly don't have the time, and you're not ready to hire someone full-time for that role either. For you, I recommend Blunt Branding. Blunt Branding principals Kirsten Nelson and Anthony Garcia are focused on improving your bottom line. Most marketing firms are excited to make your logo, packaging, and website very pretty, but they leave responsibility for improving your bottom line up to you. They don't want that kind of responsibility. But that is pretty much the most important part of marketing, right? Kirsten and Anthony will help you engage new customers, funnel them to your point of sale, and keep them coming back to you and telling their friends. No doubt, this is a paid commercial spot, but that does not mean they bought my opinion. I've worked with Blunt Branding on 3 projects now for various clients, and every single time they have done more than they have promised and over-delivered on results. I love how they generate new revenue and focus on that as the goal instead of just making me a pretty logo. Similarly, every friend I've referred them to has come back to thank me, and that just does not happen every day. So grab a pen and paper because the website address is coming. If you want someone to implement marketing programs that feed your bottom line, give Blunt Branding a call. They will share proven techniques to increase your audience and generate sales while using cutting-edge technology in the background that make all of this easy, automatic, and trackable. Go to shapingfire.com/Blunt Branding to find out more. You can also click the link in our weekly newsletter. Blunt Branding. Marketing that makes you money. Welcome back. You are listening to Shaping Fire, and I'm your host, Shango Los, and our guest this week is Dr. Dominic Corva of the Center for the Study of Cannabis and Social Policy. So, Dominic, before the break, we were talking about the level that legislators were educated at, and your position was pretty much they know enough to know how to collect taxes, and they want to know how much tax money they're going to get so that they can add that to the kitty. And the impact of that is an incomplete legalization, because while people are allowed to purchase cannabis at stores and commercial entities with licenses are allowed to grow it, we don't have decent public toking laws in most of the states. The home grow numbers are very low. That creates a situation where people need to bring their grows indoors to be able to get it grow enough for themselves. And in some states like Washington don't even have home grow. So it's really frustrating, folks, that it feels like we have legalization, but we don't really, because it was only partial. considering the fact that we are making something legal that has been historically taboo for so long, as someone who studies policy, do you think that this is what we should expect? I mean, is it too much for us to expect to get full legalization right off the bat because everybody's all freaked out that it's legal at all?
Yeah, well, there's two things there. I'm going to start with the fact that really, of course, we are, legalization basically means taxation and regulation, and it refers specifically to a commodity, really. Legalization is about the commodity. It's about the plant as a commodity. It's something you exchange money for in society. That's very different from legalizing, a culture or a people who tend to use that plant, but they themselves are not viewed as terribly responsible, desirable citizens in society. So, hence the objection to home growing, hence the objection to public toking and so forth. But the good news is, point number two, is that this does actually hit the state in its revenue basket, basically, especially the public smoking or event smoking. The homegrown maybe a little less so, but certainly I believe there's plenty of incentive for the case to be made to lawmakers that you increase tourism, that you increase opportunities for folks to make money, increase opportunities to collect taxes and so forth by allowing for events. By allowing for, the cannabis cafe, as it were.
Yeah. So do you think that it's just a matter of time then that the legislators are putting themselves on enough of a line to allow legal cannabis to exist, period? And so after people get used to what's happened so far, then they're going to move more into, social, public social toking places and increased homegrown things like that, where we're just, baby stepping it?
Well, it's going to depend on the lobbyists, really. It's not about them getting used to anything. It's about essentially the priorities of the trade organizations that are learning to use lobbyists, maybe a little bit better than they used to for many of them. Some of them already were pretty good at it, but that's common ground for all of them, no matter which lobbyists we're talking about. I think that that is a little higher on the priority. Homegrown, less so in Washington states. I think that it will probably come around a little bit more by osmosis and a little bit more because, every other state is going to have a home grow, even if it's restrictive.
So as far as who those lobbyist folks are, would you say that in most of the states you've got one or two or maybe three commercial lobbyist groups, and then maybe one or two kind of underfunded patient groups? And then while there's certainly a lot of law enforcement that are in favor of cannabis reform, you've got usually a law enforcement lobby that's trying to fight it, and maybe concerned parents and religious organization. I mean, do they tend to fall in these same flavors in every state?
No, definitely not. Definitely not. I mean, take a look at California alone. The makers of fentanyl, are funding the no on the proposition to the tune of $500,000. It's a pharmaceutical corporation, right? You have way more and bigger interests in California. It's calculus, calculus 4, as opposed to algebra 2 in Washington. In terms of the various interests, how big they are, how widespread they are, and how much money there are, as well as how many lobbyists there are. Certainly the distributors have a lobbyist in California in a way that distributors don't have a lobbyist in Washington at this point. Not their own particular special interests. You have much bigger and more powerful dispensaries in certain areas of the state, which are on their own quite distinct in their interests from the producers and processors. As opposed to here, where they all kind of grew up a little bit together because we reinvented the wheel. So California is very different. Other states, it'll be a little bit more, more like you described, probably. But California is just the big whale. It's what it does affects so much of the market nationally, even if it's just the California state consumption market, which is obviously it's not, that it will have a bit more of a distorting effect, I think, on what the other interests have at their disposal in terms of arguments.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. What's going on in California now, their lobbyist groups have had a lot more runway than Colorado and Washington had because, like you said, we reinvented the wheel. We started from nothing, so everyone was just trying to get up to speed to figure out what the hell was going on to begin with. But California not only has got a long cannabis history, but they've been able to watch policy implementation in the other states. And so now people are taking their positions earlier and with more money. So, all right, so let's talk about California. California is like the 8th largest economy in the world. And for better or for worse, it does look like the Adult Use Marijuana Act is going to pass. And, the passing of that law in California is probably going to hit the industry like a tsunami. What impact do you see that having on the national conversation and maybe even more importantly on the cannabis market itself?
Well, let me just say that really it was the, reformation of California's Prop 215 just a year or two ago that has already set off the tsunami you describe. Because that, which was legislatively driven and also connected with Gavin Newsom's entrepreneurial policy approach to cannabis politics, that set sort of a statewide set of basic conditions for jurisdictions to license and register the cannabis market per se. Now, the first 2 years of it really was about and is about just kind of like getting your paperwork in. Now, the Adult Use of Marijuana Act, obviously, when it passes, will have another set of things, but they're not going to be replacing this very recently created medical marijuana thing. They're going to be intersecting with it in terms of the rulemaking, the regulations, and so forth. So the tsunami's already started, but also the how long it takes for all of this to happen. I think that, the rules are set through like 2023 in terms of when things happen, in terms of permitting and so forth. So you're going to be looking at a few years of, continued volatile growth in California, which, of course, already had the black market tsunami going. So I think there's a lot of attention being focused on the initiative. It is significant. It will bring, I think, new opportunities for new, probably investment players to participate. But otherwise will be a continuation of what we've been it's been going on since the 1970s in California, Mm-hmm. The green rush has never stopped in California. It started in the 70s and has never stopped. And, every year it's gotten bigger. When I arrived in Southern Humboldt 5 years ago, everybody thought, wow, it's just blown up. It's so huge. All these strangers are coming here. It's crazy. I just saw, a note on a recent news article in Humboldt that was talking as though really in the last 5 years is when it's really blown up, and now it's gotten out of control and so forth. And I was already hearing that 5 years ago. And then I realized, well, probably 5 years before that, people were saying that as well. And certainly the numbers seem to bear out in terms of the California market economy.
Do you think that once California does pass adult use, that it's just going to increase investor confidence so that there's just going to be all of these new investment opportunities and laws passed in other states, providing like California is like a tipping point? Absolutely.
Absolutely. People talk about all states as though they're equal. Like when we get to half the states with these laws, then Congress will have to do something. Well, it's not half the states; it's the right states, really. And California is an incredibly economically powerful state. Its politicians will be, its national politicians are connected to the state and local politicians and the political party machines. They will then be able to carry that to Congress in a much more confident manner. Gavin Newsom has really blazed a trail in terms of, approaching cannabis like, gay marriage in terms of political capital. So he got ahead of the other politicians. He realized, this is the way society is going. This is the way, the public is viewing things now. And you know what? Like, I can get support out of it as opposed to it being a third rail that nobody can touch. But you're right. Certainly the nationalization and internationalization of investments into the cannabis industry alone, that California's situation is going to open up, that will probably be the biggest reverberator in terms of how the messages get national.
You know, they haven't even voted yet, and you can already feel it everywhere. You can feel people, you know, expecting it to pass, and therefore they're jumping in early and getting their ducks in a row and getting their money raised and making their contacts. You can just feel it's like a whole bunch of cars that are lined up at a starting gate, and they're all revving their engines and burning oil and all ready for it to pass in November to make the whole thing a reality. It's actually rather enormous and startling, actually.
Yeah, but I mean, I feel like those engines have been revving for a little while now. One of the interesting things that I think California, the biggest thing I think for California, at least Northern California, is that I think that we're going to see the opening up really of more liberal zoning laws, actually. And I don't know if you understand this, but certainly like in the Bay Area, why don't they have hundreds of dispensaries in the Bay Area? Well, because, over the last 10, 15 years, they reacted to medical marijuana by almost immediately, making it impossible for there to be a location for folks to sell it in a dispensary. It's not that they outlawed it, they zoned it out. And I think that this process will allow for the zoning in of properties, especially of retail stores, because it is kind of ridiculous that the Bay Area has actually so few retail cannabis spots compared to Southern California or LA, for example, and probably the highest per capita consumption of cannabis, in the country. With most of that, I think going through the black market.
It's interesting to think about that because, you're all like, this has already been happening for some time, but it seems like the industry as a whole has been held back by the fact that they haven't really gotten the full legal green light, which tends to keep all of this, legal capital on the sidelines. And so while California has obviously had this rolling green rush since the 70s, there were natural barriers to entry simply because your money wasn't necessarily safe. And so a lot of the legal money found it as too high of risk. And now suddenly that's all going to be open and there's going to be this gushing influx of new investment capital. It should be very interesting to see how much repetition in the market there is. I would imagine that there's probably going to be this huge swelling in the market, and then, probably a bubble and then a shaking out of, secondary and tertiary players that just don't have it in them to hang in what's going to be such a competitive market.
Yeah, but so much of California is already oriented outside the state anyway. Certainly the newer investors that are trying to capture, California state consumption probably are not thinking about this the right way. You want to use California to jump into the national market, not to use California to jump into the California market. So right now, the issue is that legalization is still about California and California's market. And now, what AMA allows you to do is write maybe a business plan with a little more confidence over a longer time frame, because you don't have an initiative coming up every year as a possibility to change things. Now you kind of have a little bit longer sight and can see how it's going to open up. You can identify, which parts of California are particularly ripe for, let's call it what it is, transitioning from, black markets oversupply into, white market regulated channels. And, what's going to hold that up is going to be taxes. It's still going to be more expensive, and in California, a lot more expensive than the black market, which is absolutely full of it, and the investors are not, pouring their money into that. They want to, transform or capture as much of the black market as they can, and they will be running straight into the desire of policymakers to put a huge tax on it, a series of huge taxes, local, state, county. They're starting out lower than we are. Obviously, ours is probably, at 34%. I don't think anybody else can be starting with that, but our 34 is another 9 plus, whatever else people put on it. I think we're going to be starting at 17 in California, probably, at the state. And then, You're going to get, what is there in the Bay Area? I think there's already a 5% in Oakland, something like that. So I don't know. The investor money has to go towards something very concrete with a business plan that they understand already. And I believe that the money really should be going into probably branding, because that's the first thing that gets to jump state lines. What they want to do is probably gobble up the smaller actors, buy them out, or take their brand and put it on steroids. Really ready it for something bigger than the California market.
I think that's really insightful when you say that California, more than being its own market interest, is actually just the gateway, if you will, to the rest of the national market. It's since there is not federal legalization yet, it's kind of like the minor leagues where everybody is getting trained and ready for federal normalization, when then they can then roll out to the rest of the company. That makes a lot of sense. Hey, we need to take another short break. We'll be right back. You are listening to Shaping Fire. Look inside this crystal ball with me for a moment. I'm looking just a couple months into the future. I'm seeing the future of the Shaping Fire podcast. The show sure has grown. I've continued to interview fascinating cannabis industry luminaries, and our audience has gotten huge. It has doubled and redoubled and doubled again. There are high fives all around the Shaping Fire World Headquarters. New listeners are subscribing every day and begin to listen to the back catalog of all the great interviews there. And that is where the Shaping Fire audience learns about your company. You were incredibly smart today to become an early adopter and place a commercial in Shaping Fire's early episodes. If you become an advertiser on the Shaping Fire podcast now, today, you are going to pay a fraction of the cost we'll be asking in just 2 months. And yet, all the audience that listens to our back catalog of interviews will hear about your company again and again. It's a great deal for you. Pay a small amount now because the show is so new, but take advantage of the huge listening audience we will have forever. This crystal ball is not a smoke dream. Do yourself a solid and contact us today for rates on podcast and newsletter advertising. Email hotspot@shapingfire.com to find out more. Welcome back. You are listening to Shaping Fire. I am your host, Shango Los, and our guest this week is Dr. Dominic Corva of the Center for the Study of Cannabis and Social Policy. So before the break, Dominic, we were talking about how important California was because it's the 8th largest economy in the world, and how even more than just, wanting to open business there for its own sake, because California is such a big market, of how it's actually a gateway to the rest of the nation once federal legalization takes place. And, folks who are looking ahead on how their businesses are going to evolve over, the next 10 years, they have to be aware of the possibility of international players as well, because once we get to the point that product can move across state lines, so someone might be able to produce it in California or Texas and then ship it to Connecticut or Colorado or Arkansas or whatever. Once those borders are sorted out, that there's going to be people pushing to be able to start bringing in product internationally, and places like Mexico and Uruguay are already thinking about, let's grow outdoor cannabis here, let's convert it into oil, and let's ship that to the United States. What do you think of is the likelihood that will be an aggressive timeline that will happen rather quickly? Because, there's a lot of folks who are planning on producing cannabis oil in the U.S., but if suddenly Mexican cannabis oil is coming in, to be used in edibles and all, this huge market, that's going to just crush the prices here. What do you see in your crystal ball as far as that's concerned?
Well, it's already happening with CBD. In terms of international lines and so forth. It's against the law, but the policy seems to be to let it alone. I was contacted recently by some CBD company that had, opened up in Seattle, and I don't know what they thought I did, but they wanted me to, get some advertising from them or something like that. But basically, I was like, well, first of all, I can't do that. We're a federal nonprofit 501c3, and we don't do, we don't buy or sell cannabis. We're a research service. But the other thing is obviously the international hemp oil scene, a lot of it was in China, probably still is, but a lot of it is now coming from Europe, from German hemp and so forth. And it's being, shipped absolutely across international lines. It's being shipped products that aren't approved by the FDA. It's being shipped powder, crystals, and so forth. So that's one thing. It's already happening. It's happening especially through CBD. However, you're right. You got to look at other countries that are going to be willing to export and able to export to other countries before they're able to export to the United States. So Colombia, right off the bat, is planning on essentially, treating cannabis like coca in terms of medical cannabis and exporting it to the rest of Latin America, like Bolivia and Peru export certainly coca leaves to other parts of Latin America. So, Colombia is already on that in Latin America. We'll see what happens elsewhere in South Asia. In India, certainly there's a Dr. Sunil Agarwal. You'd have to ask him a little bit more about that. But, the South Asian markets will cross borders, although you've got the Philippines right there, and they're ready to kill anybody who's accused of being a drug dealer right now. So you have some weird things going on. I think that with the United States, it is going to be a while before it's able to cross state lines, and that actually might put us behind in terms of our ability to export our own product, because Colombia will have had practice, maybe India will have had practice, and so forth. But the way things work here, you got to look at our trade agreements, actually. And it'll be interesting. The moment you start seeing cannabis, medical cannabis, or otherwise start to be written into trade agreements is when you start to get it across the border. So we have NAFTA, right? We have TPP. We have CAFTA. We have, actually an interlocking Byzantine maze of trade agreements all over the world that are the result of the last 30 years of globalization. And those things, I think they change slower than our drug policy laws here. So that's one thing that I would say is that we're going to develop our own internal, possibly export market. Maybe even we'll start to get, if Congress doesn't act after California does, maybe we'll start to get like a West Coast trade zone for cannabis or something like that that starts to open up. But it's going to be in fits and starts. It's really it's a little unpredictable, but certainly I don't think it's happening anytime soon. I think it's happening outside of our country very soon. I think Colombia is going to be doing it right away. But not to the United States, but to other Latin American countries.
Wow, there's so much to chew on there. I mean, for speculation, that seems to suggest that American investment capital that wants to get involved with cannabis might be better informed by investing in the third world, since they're going to be moving faster because they've got a smaller regulatory structure and perhaps less trade agreements to worry about. So that's number one. Number two, it's interesting to consider that the various protectionist ways that the United States goes about things could actually put us in the back seat as far as international trade on cannabis. And then I guess the idea that folks are already doing it now, bringing crystallized CBD from hemp in from China and everything, really shows how often policy can be made by selective enforcement, because it's already illegal to do that. But for the time being, they don't seem to be enforcing against it, which suddenly default makes it pseudo-legal.
Yeah, it's a weird kind of version of our own medical cannabis laws from years ago. This default kind of like policy of lack of enforcement or lower priority of enforcement, which opens things up. It would be very difficult now to, I think, take down all the people who are importing hemp products. In terms of international financial capital investing. Well, I'll tell you exactly how that works, Shango. It's about real estate. So international financial capital, especially when it comes to agricultural products, is about real estate. It's about buying the land. It's not about making money off of these very, very cheap perishable, agricultural commodities. And Latin America is not going to be treating, cannabis as anything other than an agricultural commodity. Medical one, sure, but it's not going to be an added value industrial product or anything like that. So I think that what you got to look at is where people buy property, but also distribution, international distribution. I also think that that's something we didn't touch on in California. It's a very important part of the scene. Is that folks who want to make a bundle off of cannabis, distribution is probably going to be huge. It didn't kind of happen that way in Washington, but that's one of the ways in which California is going to show these other little states, essentially with the little cannabis markets, how it's done. I do believe that distributors are going to play a huge role, especially because of the way we have all these various compliance issues with, the tracking of cannabis, and we'll continue to do so for the foreseeable future. So that intersection of tracking and distribution is going to be huge. And if you look at international financial capital, look at where it buys land.
So before we go too far away away from the international topic, I think this is an important point to point out for folks who are considering getting, processing licenses in their own state, because folks, when they're gauging their risk, they're thinking, okay, well, we know that the marijuana is going to sell, and we know that there's going to be brands from our state, and so since we know that essentially the sales cycle for cannabis at the beginning is, do you have weed? Yes, sold, right? That a lot of people jump in just believing that if they can get the license, if they can set up their business, if they can just stay in business and find enough capital, that their product is guaranteed to sell. And even if it's going to be a decade before any kind of cannabis oil is going to be imported from, say, Mexico, 10 years is not a long time when investing $500,000 in setting up a processing company at the state level. And I think that it's a good time to remind folks to gauge their risk and not get in over their heads, because this cascade of one tsunami after another, and then the law changes, and now suddenly the potential for state to state transfer, and then international. It's going to be a bucking bronco ride for, a good 20 years, and people should make sure that they're ready for that before they invest their retirement capital into it.
For sure. But I really don't think that there's as much of that, retirement capital kind of investment that's happening. A lot of the startups, certainly for our states, were a little more like that. But, what investment capital likes to do is merge and acquire. So they'll be going around looking for failing businesses. They make people an offer they can't refuse. And then they build their, portfolio essentially of, real estate and production sites that are going to network together. And that's the way for the big guys. And I think that's also the way for the smaller guys, the folks who actually want to hang in there and be a part of this instead of build it up and sell it. Which is a common entrepreneurial, notion, is that they are going to have to, form cooperative enterprises of some sort. That if you have a horizontal merging going on as opposed to vertical merging, then you're going to be able to, I think, be a little more resilient than if you just insist on sticking it out on your own.
That's a really good point. Just because, I've talked to so many folks in Washington and Colorado and Oregon who have, started their mom and pop businesses with the intention of going national. That doesn't mean that's how it's going to be going forward. That's a really good point, because now that, traditional investment capital is feeling more confident and the risk is decreasing, we're going to see more businesses taken over by acquisition and by, more traditional capital sources, where it's not just going to be mom and pops that then, get elevated to the big leagues. And a lot of that capital is used to a higher amount of risk than, me losing my retirement capital because I gave it to my uncle, or something like that. Yeah,
for sure. Well, I mean, when it comes down to it, a lot of the, I don't know, a lot of the investment when it comes down to it, I think in the 502 system started with $250. And everybody who actually paid that $250 and got an application for something in that little 30-day window that we did not know would be pretty much the only window where that could happen. Those licenses became commodities. They became commodities when, even if they're failing, they became commodities if, you've lost everything, you can still sell that license, basically. So, the window for investment in the system for smaller folks, I think that was it, to be honest, in terms of the direct handling. It's going to be tough to break into retail when they open up new retail windows. The state's going to want the same retailers. They're going to want people who've proven that it's been done. They're going to want people from the list they already have. So it's very interesting.
In a lot of ways, that dynamic is the same as the New York taxi token, where, you're buying and selling these for, a couple $100,000 or whatever, because they're limited. They've become a commodity themselves.
Right. That's right. That's exactly right. Limited edition, scarce resource.
Yeah. Right on. Well, cool. Well, very good, Dominic. I think that's where we're going to stop for today. Thanks so much for being on the show and making time.
You're quite welcome, Shango. It's my pleasure every time.
Dr. Dominic Corva is Executive Director of the Center for the Study of Cannabis and Social Policy. You can find out more about CASP at cannabisandsocialpolicy.org. You can find more episodes of the Shaping Fire podcast and subscribe to the show at shapingfire.com and in the podcast section of the Apple iTunes Store. On the Shaping Fire website, you can also subscribe to the weekly newsletter for insight into the latest cannabis news and product reviews. On the Shaping Fire website, you will also find transcripts of this podcast as well. For information on me and where I will be speaking, you can check out shangolos.com. Does your company want to reach our national audience of cannabis enthusiasts? Email hotspot@shapingfire.com to find out how. Thanks for listening to Shaping Fire. I've been your host, Shango Los.